the presentation today is entitled, Did You See the News? Linking Local News and Regional Development. And as has become clear from the presentation of my CV, I'm actually not, haven't done that much work on the media side, so to speak, in the past. Rather, I have been concentrating and focusing on working on innovation-related topics. So how come that I went to this kind of topic? Or how did I came about this topic? It was actually as an empirical researcher, we were always keen on finding new data sources, something to work with, something to explore. And there I noticed at a certain point in time that there's a rich data set on news, or that news generally represents a very rich data set. So I started exploring that. And while doing that, I realized there's much more to it. And this keynote presentation is very much about outlining what I believe is an interesting research topic to be explored much more so than what has been done in the past. So let's get started. Of course, if we talk about these type of topics, we know that in order to have a rich understanding of regional development, we have to look at people's behavior, right? In the end, whatever we see out there is the result or the consequence of people's behavior. And this behavioral view on economic actors is quite well established, obviously, in regional science, economic geography, and related disciplines. Very famously, already in the 60s, ideas relating to the diffusion and adaptation of innovation, as well as the ideas of mental maps, you see some very interesting ones at the bottom of these slides, built upon the idea that we have to look at really people's behavior, not just structures, in order to understand what's going on. Alan Praed famously implemented this type of idea in the behavior location choice series, which I'm pretty sure most of you are very familiar with. Today, these type of research has found a new home or new relation in evolutionary economic geography, amongst others. You see the 3 dots below there. So there's obviously much more. It's a little bit a narrow presentation here. But in evolutionary economic geography in particular, rests on the idea of these bounded rational actors, and very much then on the idea that behavior needs to be studied in order to understand, for instance, regional development. And behavior, as we all know, is very much based on the available information and the interpretation, right? So we do and act in specific ways because we have learned something, we have been informed about something, and we have interpreted it in a specific way. But then if you look into the research in our type of field, regional studies, economic geography, you do see that a lot of this research focuses on the information, on knowledge of a very specific group of actors, of economic actors. We could call them experts or decision makers, right? So if you think back even to the earliest type of research on this type of matter, like by Marshall and Jaffe later on in the 80s, where the idea of knowledge spillover came up, it was always about knowledge spillovers between experts. For instance, innovators or entrepreneurs, or spillovers between academia and the private sector. And we have really invested quite a lot in this type of idea and doing this type of research by studying not only knowledge spillovers, but then also basing concepts around these idea, open innovation ecosystem approaches that very much look into the activities and behavior of economic actors, individuals, but also groups that engage in innovation processes or related type of processes. And we have studied this from a network perspective, for instance, looking at firm networks, local, regional firm networks that very much, at least when it comes to the empirics, are very much based on the perception and data we obtained on with respect to managers or engineers, where we know, okay, with whom do they try to interact? What are factors underlying that? What role does, for instance, geographic proximity play, and other types of proximity in that respect? We then looked further by looking at interregional connections. From where do these type of people source knowledge? Where do they bring knowledge to? How does this information and knowledge diffuse in space? And this is great. And I think we have really learned quite a lot there and really made great progress. However, sometimes in some circumstances, looking only at these type of expert groups or decision makers, how we want to call that, might not be enough. Sometimes we might actually be much more interested in how the regional population behaves, let's say the average inhabitant in a specific locality. And that is very relevant, for instance, if we assess the impact of political and social initiatives, where we really want to see whether behavioral change on a broader basis takes place in a specific case, right? I think in economics it's also very much common to look at consumer behavior. You don't want to sell your products to, let's say, just experts. Sometimes you do, but in many cases, you actually want to sell your products to a wider audience, right? And then it's important to understand their behavior and where do they get the information from. So the question then is, how does the general population, be it in a specific place, be it in a specific organization, so how does the general population informs itself or is informed? Where does it get the information onto which it can base its behavior? Obviously, it can obtain that from direct experiences, observing certain events, seeing things basically happening around them. They do, most of us at least, still, I mean, the pandemic is challenging that a little bit, but most of us still do have real social interactions. So we interact with other people, get to talk to them, see what they are doing, learning from them. Then we have this social media where we obtain a lot of information as well. Not always the correct one, but we do get a lot of information there, maybe even information overflow. And then on top of that, we do have, and I think most of us are very much interested in looking at international and national news, right? A lot of us watch TV, read newspapers, listen to the radio, something like that. And this is full of news, right? But then there is something I think most of us are also quite familiar with, and which I will argue is very interesting to look at from a geographical, from a regional perspective, and that is really regional and local news. So if we talk about behavior of the general population in a location, it gets a lot of information through all these different channels, and one of these is also regional and local news. And this will be very much in the center of this presentation. So the first question then is, okay, why should we care? Why should we care about regional news or news if we're primarily interested in economic behavior or the economic consequences of behavior? Well, you've seen these type of wonderful headlines, these type of very placative newspaper headlines, cover stories, and a lot of people see that on a daily basis. And the idea is that this may not only pass on certain type of information, but also has some consequences. If we look at that a little more systematically, there are a number of ways in how what is written, for instance, in newspapers, what is presented in news, actually may provide certain information or interpretations thereof to a wider audience. For instance, the newspapers or news media in general makes a selection of what it considers to be newsworthy. So what events are reported about and what are not reported about. It also can present the same event in different ways, rather positively, rather negatively, something that's usually referred to as sentiment. But also framing is very important. So what belongs to a specific topic? What events are covered under the same heading? What things are related to each other? So all this, which most of us as scientists were very well aware of, because it's also something to a certain degree we also have to consider in writing papers. It is of course much bigger in terms of importance when we talk about news media, if we talk about newspapers, TV stations, and so on. So also the ways of how things are presented in general on the front page, for instance, of a newspaper, on the first web page, or do you have to look for specific information somewhere below that? So if we think about the functions that news media provides in this contrast, it has been, of course, known for a long time that it expands the information basis, meaning it provides information on specific events. It frames discourses, as I mentioned before. It relates certain events to each other. It adds certain content to it, certain context as well. And by that, journalists are also human beings. They make interpretations, they have certain attitudes and sentiments concerning certain topics. And if we look into this media research, which has been existing for quite a long time, it turns out that news media, or what is, let's say, written in a newspaper, just to make this simple, does not always have the same type of relevance. Rather, it becomes particularly relevant when we're talking about complex issues. Take a very recent example, the pandemic, right? How many of us really read these scientific newspapers? I mean, nowadays, I would imagine more so than maybe in the beginning, but in particular in the beginning, we have been presented information, interpretations of this relatively complex issue from newspapers, from watching TV, from the radio, and so on. So whenever issues are relatively complex, and again, here we talk more in the context of a wider population, we turn towards something that synthesizes information, that presents it in an easier to assess fashion, and these are news. And this is usually also the case when things are outside our direct observation. So if I can watch a football match myself, I may not read the report afterwards. But if I didn't have the possibility to watch the game, then I will be highly interested in reading the summary thereof. Right? So if we can't observe certain things, then we turn towards the news. And generally, at least in the context I'm talking about, this particularly applies to events that tend to be further away in terms of geographic distance. So things we cannot observe, like the outbreak of the pandemic somewhere in Asia. And all this together, all these ways of how information can be presented, has been shown to matter economically. So there have been a lot of studies showing that what is reported in the news does correlate with certain employment developments, with general economic output, business cycles, and productivity. But even more directly, there are a lot of studies showing that consumer confidence, for instance, is directly influenced and shaped by how things are presented in the news. Stock market prices are very well known to be related to what is reported in the news, for instance, about the company itself, but also about the entire context in which a company operates. Firm reputation, housing prices, and of course also election results, which then usually have big economic consequences. So there's quite a lot of research existing that shows the economic consequences of news or the economic impact. And this is also the case when we look at the topic I'm very interested in, and that is the acceptance and diffusion of innovation and technologies, which is also because in the end, technologies imply that certain products, or innovation implies that certain products are brought to the market. So people actually use these things. And in order to use these things, they need to get information, and not always do they do so through type of expert channels. In many cases, it is the way new technologies and innovation are presented in the news that shapes the perception and the potential acceptance of that. And there are fantastic case studies looking at, for instance, nuclear technology, food biotechnology, bioenergy, and wind power, which is right now in Norway a big topic, for instance. So how many onshore wind turbines can be installed here in Norway? What is acceptable from a social perspective, but also from an environmental perspective? And this debate is very much taking place in the news, and thereby shaping the perception of the general population, which then eventually decides what type of policies will be implemented, or what type of people will be elected that implement these policies. However, the question now is, so what? So there already exists a lot of research. So why should we, as regional scientists, economic geographers, and related disciplines care about that? Well, there are a whole lot of interesting gaps. Most importantly, most of the studies I've just referred to, and many more, they focus at the national level. So we do know that differences in the way news reports things, the way differences in the way things are presented in the news, for instance, new technologies, they differ between nations, and there they make a difference. But what about the subnational, regional scale? Isn't there maybe also some variation that is interesting to be explored? And I will come back to that in a second. Also, there's relatively little research on how news then relate to general, let's say, economic regional structural characteristics. So general, the relationship between what is in the news and some other kind, let's say, of output measures. I presented some before, but those are not the majority of studies. The majority of studies in that field rather focuses on what's within the news itself. How does it develop over time? Another dimension that is very much in the focus of this type of research. Nowadays, we also see a lot of research that focuses directly on social networks and not so much on professional news, like professional newspapers, TV stations, and so on, and thereby a little bit ignoring that a lot of the content we see on social networks, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, is directly taken from these professional news providers. As in many things, the research is quite US-centered, so it would be interesting to explore Europe a little bit. Also, the economic dimension is somewhat underdeveloped, as particular political scientists and sociologists look at these type of topics. So there's a lot to explain despite what I've presented before. And last but not least, also in this literature, at least traditionally, it was very much case study oriented. And only recently we see really new type of empirical approaches emerging. Big data, to name one of the, network analysis, text analysis, these type of things, which in itself are already interesting to explore. But the key point is in particular the first one. So what do we know really about the subnational scale? So and then the question is, why would we expect that there is a subnational or regional dimension to news and potentially its impact? Well, I try to summarize this in this wonderful triangle structure for three particular reasons. The first one being the regional organization of news itself, or better, of the news media. So if you think, for instance, newspapers, right? If you buy a newspaper, most likely this will either be a national newspaper or a newspaper that is dedicated towards a very particular regional area. Indeed, most newspapers do have quite precisely defined circulation areas, geographically defined, and in a lot of cases, this is at the subnational level. Also, national newspapers, for instance, do tend to have sections of their newspapers that are dedicated towards the content of specific regions. This goes down sometimes even to the local level. So in a lot of newspapers, you actually find city-level information or specific sections dedicated towards a specific locality. So, and this creates automatically a type of regional dimension, by meaning that in certain places, you read a specific news outlet at a higher probability than in other places. That's the first factor. The second one is regional variation of news supply and demand. And this is really interesting. If you think about what is presented in the news, well then, as I mentioned before, this is driven by newsworthiness. What type of events are perceived to be important? And what is important in the end here, clear economic incentives. What will be sold, or what makes the media being sold in the end, the newspaper, what makes people turn into a specific newspaper, radio station or TV station. And it has not surprisingly therefore been shown that the media is studying very well what is demanded by their audience, right? So they do know quite well what is the audience and what are the preferences and the interests of this audience. And thereby it will also argue or present news in a way that is very much in line with existing opinions. I'll come back to that point later. So if we think about how should a regional dimension or subnational dimension of news emerge from that, we do know that human beings are spatially or have a certain spatial interest. That is, they do have a local interest. They do tend to care more about things that are in close geographic proximity to them than about things that are further away. So from this, one can imagine that there exists or there emerges a regional dimension because people, that is the audience that buys certain news outlets, has the preference for hearing about local events and local news. But there's also another relationship existing in this context, and that is news supply having an impact on the demand. So if you are, as a newspaper, for instance, I stick to that example, interested in serving your local audience, then you have to report about local events. But that implies there need to be newsworthy events. And if those are not existent, then you basically have to look elsewhere. also, and this is shown in a lot of increasing number of empirical papers, that indeed this location, so what is happening in a specific region, then is also visible in the content of news. And as I will argue, and as some of the papers at the national level show quite clearly, news has an influence on the likelihood that certain events or behavior is happening or being observed. So by impacting the likelihood that events take place, that perceptions develop in a certain direction or preferences are established, they impact in the end what's happening. And Gartz in 2018 provided a very nice example of that. So he did some estimations and found that, for instance, if you find, or if the number of articles on the unemployment situation in a specific locality increases by 1.8, which is really not that much, you can see how that impacts people's perception of the true economic situation. So despite all their potential direct observations and other ways of obtaining this information, just with respect to what's happening and what's presented in the newspapers, changes by up to 30%, depending on which direction the original situation was described. So there is a huge impact. And we see this then, that this variation in what's in the news, we can see this also in some early studies on the matter. So one we did in, or actually 2 years ago already, we looked at how frequently there are potential entrepreneurial events in a region. We utilize press releases, which is a more direct measure of what's happening in a region in terms of potentially newsworthy events, and found there a striking regional variation in that, heterogeneity in that, meaning in certain regions, newspapers, for instance, or other news outlets have simply more events to choose from than in other regions. We did another study together with Burcu Özgen, who will present tomorrow something very interesting, so I highly recommend the session she's in S17. There we looked at the share of innovation news. So we really looked at newspapers and looked for articles that refer to innovation or new technologies, in this case across Germany. And then we also found that it varies substantially and systematically between regions. So in some regions, we find much more, a higher share of news related to innovation than in other regions, right? So taken together, we see on the one hand, this discrepancy with respect to events, in the case of entrepreneurial activities, that may be perceived by some as news, potentially newsworthy. And on the other hand, we also see that what shows up in news has some variation in that regards. So this interplay of demand and supply may create another type of features, feeds into this potential regional dimension of news. The last point, or the last factor of this triangle, is the regional embeddedness of the news media. And here the idea is also quite simple. Journalists and other people that are active in the news media, they are not operating in isolation. They are also human beings, and by that means they are part of a region. They do experience local events, which again shape what they will write about. They are themselves maybe exposed to local media. Hopefully they are not reading just their own newspaper or listening to their own radio station, but also look for others that are offered in the place they are located. They are embedded into social networks, and for these we do know that they do have a quite distinct local dimension, which implies more likely to be exposed to certain preferences, sentiments, but also information. There is a lot of discussion, in particular in political science, to what extent the media has a kind of agenda-setting ability. So to what extent it has an independent interest to form, to promote certain discourses, which is quite established, but the question is to what extent such may exist also at a regional level or subnational level. So in any case, and this is research that shows us also that the news media is as well as intentionally regionally shaped. So it does have, and hereby I mean really the people that work in the media, they do have a regional geographical lens through which they perceive and report about events. But generally, there is relatively little research with respect to these type of arguments at the subnational level. So there is definitely something to look into further, but I think the argument becomes quite clear. And taking all these three factors or dimensions together, I argue that indeed we can expect a quite strong and pronounced regional dimension in the news, be it in newspapers, for instance, or be it in TV stations, radio programs, and so forth. And it's really the combination of these three things that together creates this regional dimension. However, I presented this in a very simplified manner. The longer you think about, the more complex the entire process becomes. So it really then becomes what type of event, the question really then becomes what type of events are selected for what reasons to be presented in the news? What is the demand of the audience? How is the interplay between the local news media and the local audience? To what extent do non-regional events or events that take place elsewhere compete with local events? Right, so there's quite a lot of selection processes, demand and supply interplay processes in this. And what I show here is just a first take at this process. This might actually be even more complex than shown here. So there is a lot to disentangle. In any case, it seems quite straightforward to see that the news media at the subnational level does have a strong potential for reinforcing existing developments. So if there are certain preferences or certain developments in a region, they are more likely to be reported about and potentially also more positively reported about in the regional or local news media, implying that people or the local population is more likely to develop a positive attitude towards that one, which again then is taken up to present this topic at an even higher frequency and even more positive sentiments, because that implies that sales of newspapers and broadcasting will increase. So there's a strong potential for path-dependent developments in there. From a policy perspective, however, it also means that there's a potential thing to, for instance, break certain development paths, right? So if some kind of news or certain preference or certain sentiments towards topics can be introduced into this circle, it may create a new type of narrative, a new type of relation between the news media and the local audience, which may then eventually shape the behavior in a different way. But this is really then also with some ethical considerations. There's a lot to disentangle there, and I believe we're just at the very beginning of understanding this process in more depth. So let me sketch out a research agenda based on what I've said before, meaning that we do know news do have an impact. They do matter economically. However, the existing research primarily looks at the national level and with all the things I mentioned before, US-centered and so on and so forth. And that we can quite safely assume, and some early works or some works that do show that already empirically, there is this regional dimension of news coming from the processes outlined before. The question is, where do we go from here? What could be next? So I would like to sketch a short research agenda. For instance, there is in geography in particular a long tradition in thinking about regional identities, regional images. That is the idea, if we live in a specific place long enough, we develop a certain view of a region, we develop a certain identity or link to a specific identity that is present in a specific locality. There are different layers to that, so that's a multi-layered problem. You can have, of course, be part of an identity, of a local identity, of, let's say, regional identity, national identity, and so on and so forth. But there is clearly spatial variation in the degree to which people relate to their locality, but also what this locality stands for. And then the question is, okay, how do these views of a locality, what localities stand for, what type of topics or type of keywords a place is related to, where does this come from? And here research has shown that indeed the media plays a strong role and can play a strong role in creating that, right? So for instance, if we think about this fascinating debate we currently have on the places that don't matter in economic geography and regional science, To what extent is this, for instance, shared as an identity? To what extent has this found its way into the identity? And what role did the media and the presentation of these type of topics in the media played with respect to its emergence and its impact? Right? We do know at the national level the influence of investment and location choices. A couple of years back, when, for instance, in Germany, we saw the rise of, let's say, the far right in specific places. It was quite well debated in the news to what extent this may actually impact foreign direct investment. I don't know to what extent this has been researched in detail, but it was already in the news discussing to what extent certain riots or protests in a region does have a direct economic consequence with respect to location choices of firms, subsidiaries, and so on. And very interesting then is looking at these type of things also from a dynamic perspective over time. So what other places, for instance, are frequently referred to in the news that you read in a specific region, that you listen to in a specific region? So maybe there are certain relationships established between places, which is known also as news flows or information fields. That is, certain places are mentioned more frequently or with respect to specific topics, specific sentiments in places, in certain places. And then the question is, does this have potential influences on things like trade, or individuals' mobility, right? So if I read more frequently positive things about a certain place, for instance, about how well life is in cities, and I'm living in a peripheral region, does that make it more likely for me to consider moving there, right? Most likely it will. And this, of course, has direct economic consequences. Another topic is entrepreneurship, which I think would greatly benefit from considering to a stronger degree what's happening in the news and what is presented in the news. It is, I think, known for long in this literature that entrepreneurship is very much benefiting from role models. So if, for instance, there is somebody you can look up to and is presented in a very positive way that has been acting as an entrepreneur, this will have a positive impact potentially on your choice of becoming an entrepreneur yourself, or at least supporting these type of activities. And this also relates to, let's say, the economic risks that potentially entrepreneurs or that entrepreneurship is related to. So for instance, if I think about the German news media, which I do know for a certain degree, they're quite frequently entrepreneurs or managers are not presented in a very positive light, right? So they are equated with high salaries or gaining a lot of economic benefits, and not so much it is discussed what they have risked at a certain moment in life, for instance, and that things could have failed. You hardly see discussions in general about failed entrepreneurship in the news, other it is something that can be related to a specific politician, for instance. And this, of course, impacts the general perception of entrepreneurship. And if we have this regional dimension in the news, I think it's not far-fetched to think about, okay, to what extent does this support, stir up, or help entrepreneurship in the place? Similarly related is this topic on place-based agency and leadership, right? So who takes agency in a region? Who is leading the pack, so to speak? How does that emerge? To what extent is this supported or hindered by the media? How this policy can communicate with the media in order to get certain behavior and induced in places, I think is a very interesting thing to look at. Also in my field, let's say, or the field I'm usually more active in, the idea, of course, goes back to already Hagerstrand and Rogers, to what extent the acceptance and diffusion of innovation is related to what's happening in the news, which places report the first about a certain new technology, in what way it is reported about, to what extent is resistance to certain socioeconomic transformations be related to news. So we have this topic, for instance, as I mentioned before, wind turbines, so this transition towards renewable energies. There are a lot of debates about that are featured in the media, and quite distinctively or quite differently between places. And here it would be interesting to know more about to what extent this may actually have an impact on the outcome in the end. So these are just some very, very broad ideas and questions I put forward where I believe we can more or less immediately start working on this topic and we'll get some very interesting insights. Let me finish this presentation with a very preliminary conclusion, because this is, from my perspective, rather novel research area. So I don't want to draw a conclusion yet, but a rather preliminary one. So there is still a lot of things to be explored, or not still, there are a lot of things to be explored with respect to this topic. And this all starts from the idea that the regional news media is not just a one-direction information channel to which everybody has equal access, that is identical across places, or that doesn't have this distinct regional dimension. So once we get over that idea, we see many interesting research avenues, some of which I've outlined before, emerging. And then there's really this idea to what extent the news media might be a key, in particular, mediating actor or playing a mediating role between regional socioeconomic developments and individual behavior. As I outlined before, as I mentioned before, news serves as an input by, for instance, providing information, perceptions, interpretation into certain regional economic developments. But it's, of course, also an outcome, because it has to pick up on certain events that are reported about and present them in specific ways. Last but certainly not least, it is also an agent, right? It may have an own agenda. We do know certain news outlets are closer related, let's say, to the left-wing spectrum of the political agenda, spectrum, rather to the right wing. So there is certainly a difference also in terms of what is the intention or the agency of these type of news media. So as soon as we move beyond seeing news as a mere information channel, but more as an actor or agent in these type of processes, we, I think, come closer to understanding the role that news and regional news in particular can play in general for regional development processes. And this also implies that then we have to conceptualize the regional news process much more precisely than what I've done here in the very first draft, thinking about what is driving that, what are the direct impacts and the evolution over time, of course. And I want to close with the last slide by saying I did not mention that much about how to do these things empirically, but we have an entire session organized on that matter here at the ERSA conference. So the ERSA session S17, there will be a number of very interesting empirical studies presented, also how to work with this data, what type of data is out there, to disentangle some of the facts that I've outlined here. Because one thing that is already clear, and we already know, there is a strong regional variation in terms of frequency and sentiments with which certain events are presented. And below you see something coming from a database I'm working on, comparing the German average. That is the average sentiments, how positively or negatively the news are over time. Clearly see the outbreak of COVID, for instance, which turned everything down. In July or June 2020, it really impacted the news strongly. But then you see this difference between Munich and Regensburg here, Munich being the blue line, Regensburg the more positive line, the green line on top of it, showing that indeed there is some variation, not only in the general level of sentiments, meaning how positively news are in general, but also in the time dimension when certain developments take place or not. And with that, I would like to conclude and thank you very much for your patience. And I'm looking very much forward to your comments. And I already see a lot of questions popping up in the chat.